The main plaza in Mexico City, the Zócalo, was quiet that day in 1942 when the announcement came over the radio. Mexico had entered the war.
Querido público, auditorio de la República, el señor presidente, acompañado únicamente por el secretario.
In Mexico's eyes, the true enemy was Hitler's Third Reich. After all, the Germans were the ones responsible for sinking the oil tankers in the Gulf of Mexico. As a symbol of solidarity, President Franklin Roosevelt met with Mexican President Manuel Ávila Camacho in April of 1943. This marked the first time an American president had traveled to Mexico. The meeting brought about better cooperation and closer ties between the two countries. A select group of Mexican military men were chosen by competitive examination from throughout the Republic. The Mexican Expeditionary Force, as they were officially known, traveled north to the United States for instruction. This group of 300 aviators and ground personnel became known as Squadron 201. This would be the first trip out of the country for many of these men, but it also marked the first time a Mexican military unit would be trained for overseas combat duty. The send-off from Mexico was one the likes of which had never been seen before and may never be seen again. Texas was a very different place in 1944, and for the Mexicans, it was a new experience. Chosen for the task of training the Mexican pilots in the American military system was Captain Eugene Miller. Miller had been raised in Latin America and spoke Spanish fluently. Section I, as the special organization was codenamed, would utilize experienced American fighter pilots and personnel to train the Mexicans. The American commanders' first priority was the health and safety of these new pilots. The training that the Mexican recruits would undergo had already been taken by thousands of American cadets. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the chosen fighter plane. The Thunderbolt, or Jugs as it was called by its pilots, was the heaviest and most durable fighter of the war. The first fatality for the squadron occurred in Greenville. Lieutenant Crisóforo Salido died when his Thunderbolt crashed on takeoff. Weather conditions in Texas were favorable for locating bases all over the state. Some of the last instruction involved air-to-air gunnery in the border town of Brownsville, Texas. The Brownsville air-to-air gunnery training marked the end of instructional training for the 201st. On a cold, windswept day in February 1945, the squadron officially ended its training and participated in a battle flag presentation ceremony. Representatives from the Mexican and U.S. governments were present. This included high-ranking military from both countries. As the war in Europe was winding down, the attention of the Allies turned to the Pacific theater. Up to this point, the morale of the men had been low, uncertain whether they would get to use their training. The squadron now had a new enemy to focus upon. With Germany out, it would be the Japanese. It was decided that the squadron would carry the battle flag to the Philippines, where the Americans, under General Douglas MacArthur, were fighting to regain the islands. The pilot's last stop before being shipped overseas would be an airbase in Kansas City, Missouri. The trip overseas turned out to be a trial in itself. Most of the men had never been on a ship before, much less on a trans-Pacific voyage. The danger of enemy submarine attack was still present, and this, along with it being the first crossing for most of the members of the squadron, added a strain to the Pacific crossing. Ships operating in a war zone would routinely vary their course to avoid detection from enemy submarines and surface ships. With the arrival of the squadron, there was no question this was a war zone. MacArthur had just made his famous return to the Philippine island of Luzon. The squadron would be attached to the 58th Fighter Group and be based at Porac on the island of Luzon. Although the P-47 was designed primarily as a fighter plane, the Japanese aerial threat had been virtually eliminated. The 201st main job turned to ground support. Strong bonds developed, and this handful of soldiers saw some moments of fun. As a way to ease the tension of the daily or sometimes two-a-day missions, pilots got together informally at the place that became known among the men as the Aquarium. The Aztec Eagles had earned the respect of their Allied counterparts. Along with the dangers of combat missions, many pilots in the Pacific faced death in escort missions. With the liberation of Luzon all but complete, a new assigned target became the island of Formosa. Long-distance missions to Formosa were stressful. As the men prepared to be transferred to Okinawa for the invasion of Japan, the atom bomb was dropped. As Squadron 201 prepared for the journey home, they built a monument for those left behind, those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The return home was celebrated in typical Mexican fashion. The squadron had lost several men, but for the majority that did return, a hero's welcome awaited them. Pride in their country and dedication to a cause had been the main motivator for those volunteering for Squadron 201.
Tus campiñas con